Thank you for joining us. Before we begin with this session, we will start off with a couple of housekeeping announcements. This session provides interpretation in Spanish. Please go to interpretation to choose your language channel. Mute original audio to only hear the interpreter. Welcome to the Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development 2021. This is hosted by International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific. I am Rachel Ong. I will be your technical host for this session. And before we start, we would like to share some virtual housekeeping announcements with you. As participants, please turn off your videos and mute your microphones. If you are experiencing slow bandwidth, please close any unnecessary programs and/or applications on your device. Feel free to use the public chat box to engage with one another throughout the session. This session is live streamed on our Facebook page, and the recording will be available publicly afterwards. We are committed to making sure that this is an inclusive and safe digital environment and will not tolerate harassment of any kind, including but not limited to deliberate intimidation, sustained disruption of discussions. Participants are obliged to be respectful and to avoid replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. Participants who engage in disruptive behavior may be removed without prior notice. And with this, I hand the floor over to Janelle.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all in attendance today. I am particularly happy to be here facilitating this conversation, which I consider to be one that is very important, particularly as we think about the global south and all the different factors that are at play when we think about climate change. And to be honest, colonialism has been deeply related to climate from its very onset. Colonialists have used climate variability to justify their colonial practices. And in a European imperial context, climatically determined differences between human races and cultures were central to Western European conceptions of an inherent superiority over different peoples. And interestingly, the neo-colonial nature of many false climate solutions under the veil of development practices and carbon offsetting do provide opportunities for Western countries and companies to continue to pollute as normal, which disproportionately affect those in the global south. Further, many of these solutions involve displacement of indigenous and marginalized populations from their lands, leading to widespread human and land rights abuses. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will have a very interesting dialogue. And we have two panelists today, Pambana Bassett and Ikal Angelei. I hope that I'm pronouncing your names properly. And both of these individuals are activists in their own right. So Pambana is an international organizer from Harare, Zimbabwe and New York City, who is a core member of the Chiapas Support Committee, a transnational solidarity collective rooted in Zapatista principles and struggles for Black liberation and indigenous sovereignty. They accompany the fight for dignity and autonomy in Chiapas, Haiti, in Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. And these popular processes have been led by the people of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. Pambana is part of Caribbean-wide campaigns for operations and works as a program director of the Solidarity Collective's Cuba program and has been based in Havana for 6 months. Thank you so much, Pambana. In addition, we also have Ikal, who is a grassroots indigenous rights activist and community organizer, who is working towards indigenous grassroots groups and especially access to women, providing opportunities for control and governance of their territories. She works on climate and energy justice, land and environmental rights, and is the co-founder of Friends of Lake Turkana and was the Goldman Environmental Prize recipient in 2012 for her environmental justice work to protect the lake, its ecosystems, and the communities. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at University of Leicester. So we recognize that both of these individuals have had their own experiences as it relates to, rights, environmental justice, and ensuring that those who are most affected are given the opportunities for having their individual and collective voices heard. And so we like to hear the voice of Pambana and Ikal. And I have a few questions that will help us to better understand the connectedness of climate change and colonialism, particularly through their eyes. And so the first question that I would like to pose is if both panelists could highlight for us some of the combined impacts of colonial history and the processes, as well as climate change within your specific country and or region. Pambana, I would like for you to go first.
Greetings to all. Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are. And thank you so much for organizing this panel. For me, it's an honor to be alongside my co-panelists and to be alongside you all in this immense work that you've put together to bring these voices and experiences and analyses to the fore. So my organizing work is primarily focused on the fight against US imperialism that's directed at Cuba and at the Caribbean, why it is that the US targets this region and this small socialist Caribbean country, and also why it's important to challenge US imperialism in building a more just world. And why I believe Cuba's process is important to study, to defend, and to replicate or adapt in these times. So while I've lived in the Caribbean basin for the last 7 years, I've only had the privilege of living in Havana and being based there for the past 6 months, and all under very intensive, though life-saving COVID public health measures or restrictions. And during the strengthening of the US blockade to the tune of 243 additional Trump sanctions, the really obscene strengthening of the blockade, the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, which is just ridiculous, the continued ban on remittances, which is so essential for all island people and for the global South, and this is a violation of our right to family ties. And then even more recently, more sanctions and threats of military bombardment from the North against Cuba. So it hasn't been a lot of time that I've been based in Cuba, nor is it a typical time. But I'll say that, I've seen with my own eyes an alternative way of doing things, and particularly in responding to COVID, that has been led by women, that has been led by the majority African descendant population, an alternative that I wasn't sure was possible against the odds that the Cuban people face. So I invite all of you definitely to follow the work of Cubans based in Cuba who are doing this amazing work. The Martin Luther King Center in Havana. Recently, the World March of Women had a Cuba delegation. And if you go on their website or their socials, you'll find many links to Cuban women as well as queer organizers who discuss, the task at hand, the political conjuncture, their analyses, concerns, dreams, positions, and work. But I can share about, things that are objective facts that the Caribbean faces, and that I believe Cuba is showing an alternative in. So really, the Caribbean, Janelle, is in many ways a case in point in understanding how climate change was caused by colonialism. It's also a place in which we can see concrete examples of how the rich and the powerful will attack and even coup people's movements and governments that are better for people and the planet, better for the majorities. And also it's a region where it's very important, or the importance of reparations is really clear for the Caribbean's poor, and for these countries that have hard-fought independence is to build a nation that centers human dignity and well-being. It is also a region where Caribbean people are just really hit hard by climate events. So located in a basin surrounded by seas and with homes that are mostly along disappearing coastlines and coastlines of a series of archipelagos that have been deeply disfigured ecologically by plantation economies of colonialism and neocolonialism. Really, the resilience that the Caribbean must build right now as an entire region is almost unparalleled on the planet. I think that there are some similarities to other majority island regions, the Pacific Islands, for example, but the Caribbean has a set of challenges they confront, which are pretty unique. The Caribbean is also a place in which the connection to the physical environment is deep. So for the people who call the Caribbean islands and the coastal mainlands home, livelihoods, as well as the threats to those livelihoods, are deeply bound up in the natural world. Also, how people understand themselves, how we understand ourselves, how we make our bread and butter, put food on the table, how we commune with our ancestors, how we recuperate and safeguard our cultural autonomy. Those are all rooted in the soils, in the sea, in the stars, and each other. And unfortunately, similarly environmentally dependent, if that is an appropriate word, or environmentally impactful, are the capitalist development models that have been imposed by the descendants, both people and institutions, of those who enslaved and colonized African, Indigenous, and Asian ancestors and created the plantation economy. So many of the class structures imposed under colonialism remain, and in some cases there is outright colonialism or states that have been denied to varying degrees their sovereignty by France, by the US, by Britain, by the Netherlands. In the majority of the Caribbean, the two major economic fuentes or sources continue to be tourism, often with pretty deep racist and patriarchal inequities, a lot of foreign investment to benefit a small elite and mostly multinational interests. And then, of course, monocrop agriculture on lands that have not been redistributed significantly enough or without the agrarian reform necessary. So on these plantations, sugar, bananas, other chemically sprayed produce that is often farmed with labor violations because of these transnational corporations and transnational capital destining the fruits of the people's labor to export, and creating food systems that really harm the land and are not designed to feed the people. So tourism and agriculture are very sensitive to changes in the physical environment, and both have been greatly impacted by COVID and also by climate events and catastrophes. And, it's kind of a catch-22 in the sense that these industries both disfigure the environments as well as in some ways reify existing social inequities or import racial gendered inequities. They also, it's the crumbs from the benefits of them are important to people's livelihoods. And so what we're seeing with the evaporation of tourism dollars is real hardship for people. And so, in your call as a concept for this gathering, you describe, this is a moment and an opportunity. And it's certainly difficult to see this as a moment of opportunity. But I certainly think that Cuba offers an example of how extreme hardship can be used as an opportunity to transform social, political economies and systems. So the Caribbean really can expect very hard times, and we see this across the lands. One of my professors at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Northover, is on this call. and connected me with a really fantastic group of people working to create knowledge together and share practices that are both scholarly and practical. And I've learned more about how Barbudans are fighting for communal land tenure, how people in San Andres and Providencia and Santa Catalina are fighting off a Navy base and calling for their homes to be rebuilt. These are all issues that peoples across the Caribbean face. Jamaica is one of the world's top 40 climate hotspots, they call it, because of how many people live along the coast and how much of the economy is based on that, on the coastlines that are at such high risk. And the Caribbean, again, I believe, shared with the Pacific Islands, can expect more intense hurricanes, tropical storms, longer dry seasons, shorter rainy seasons, unpredictable planting, sea level rise, soil erosion, coastal flooding, storm surges, contamination of underground water supply, and impact to coastal agriculture, to built environments, flash floods, insecurity, and really chaos. And to add to this, the massive debt which the Caribbean often takes on following disasters. And debt then impedes the Caribbean's dignified response to those same disasters is unparalleled. It's the most indebted region in the world, with most Caribbean countries spending more than 50% of their GDP, and some at or above 100% on debt servicing and repayment. This is a colonial catastrophe and just complete outrage that the Caribbean, a region of a majority Black people, making up half of 1% of the world's population, but has always punched above its weight in terms of social processes and arts and creation. And, it's a tremendous region. They're at, again, the front lines of colonialism in the form of neoliberal globalization, deregulation, multinational corporations like the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization policies, and also NGO charities that don't, or that fail to recognize, one of the key parts of addressing the challenges, which is the real need to challenge racial capitalism, to challenge corporate greed and large-scale development, and to work towards decolonization, debt erasure, redistribution of wealth and ownership, collective land rights, universal health care, education, subsidized local economies, regional integration, the return of wealth that was extracted from the region with such ferocity by European and US colonialism, and also the safeguarding of Black and Indigenous ancestral practice. So I'll end there, but I, again, think Cuba is an important example and have seen it in terms of saving lives. And the Caribbean island with a similar plantation and casino economy history of 11.3 million people that has ensured that there be healthcare that's preventative and community rooted, that there be education, food that's heavily subsidized and distributed through a state process, that culture, the right to organize in unions, sports, telecommunications, that those all be rights that are shared by the majorities. And certainly Cuban women are at the center, leading in that, in terms of being the majority of scientists, being the majority of, I think it's 2/3 of positions in science and technology in Cuba are held by women. The majority of parliamentarians are women. When I go outside on the street, the people who are carrying out the community health surveys in response to COVID are among the 70% of women who are the health professionals saving lives. And it is Cuban women who have protected endemic species in Cuba. Just pretty tremendous. And I think there's been a great disservice in terms of corporate media in hiding the protagonism of the majorities, and particularly women, in building a socialist future.
That's a mouthful, to be honest. And I think you've pretty much answered most of the questions that I would have wanted to ask. But, just to pinpoint some of those very intriguing points that you highlighted. So you spoke about the challenges being faced in Cuba in particular, how colonialism and climate are indeed connected. And I'm happy that you highlighted what was happening in Barbuda, because I had the chance to visit recently, and I reiterate a lot of, those points when you look at the fact that they're fighting now for their indigenous rights and, being able to be considered indigenous is another thing that's happening. So across the Caribbean, we see where, persons are in conflict with a lot of these persons who are touting this consideration of economic development. And you said a quote, and I'll just repeat it here, when you said, Cubans recognize hardship as an opportunity to transform socio-political issues. I think that's so powerful. And I think that, given the challenges that they're facing, the fact that they can utilize what's happening as an opportunity just shows resilience in the face of change. So thank you for highlighting that, Pambana. So I'll hand over to Ikal to share her perspectives surrounding the issue of colonialism and climate, and how, one has exacerbated the other, particularly in her particular space. Ikal, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, comrades, for this conversation. It is a very critical time to be having this conversation. Sorry, I am not in the best sleep place. It is 5 a.m. in my home, and I'm in one of the villages. So just to get onto the question, I think one, great conversation from Pambana is such a brilliant, I was sort of like unpacking everything at the same time and wondering how to bring in, to complement the conversation without repeating myself. One of the things, when we look at the history of colonialism in Africa, I'll speak to Africa just because Pambana has brought out the rest of the global South in Cuba. You cannot talk about colonialism without exploitation. The concept of colonialism was pegged on exploiting the continent, the need to extract. So everything from political, social, economic, environmental relations was an extraction. So you found that the way the colonial governments came into the continent was to divide people. I come from an area which is the Turkana Basin, where we then have relatives in Ethiopia, in Sudan, South Sudan, in Uganda, and in Kenya, who we speak the same language. We are the Ataker community, but then we are divided by a border, which was put there by a colonial government. So you find all the social relations of the Ataker people was basically fragmented by a colonial framework of exploitation and extraction. So our cultural, our social relations was first fragmented. That's one of the first things around the exploitation. When you look at sort of how, if you look at many countries in the continent, you find this whole conversation of high yield, high potential areas, low potential areas. Communities, related to their lands and territories based on what they produced and how they used what they produced to barter trade and exchange with the neighboring community. But all of a sudden, the concept of high potential areas, and when we look at the high potential areas, it is areas where coffee, cocoa, gold, spices were basically taken. It was potential because it was not just being extracted for use. It was actually being extracted to be taken into into the colonial countries, into the countries, the colonies, to be traded with. So that's why the whole concept of high potential areas. So areas like mine, where it's a pastoralist community, they had not yet clicked that beef was such a high-end product. And so now it was never high potential. And if you look at the entire continent, north of Nigeria, you find, parts of Southern Africa, the Kalahari Desert, were never seen to be high potential areas. And so they were then areas where they were seen, they were left behind. And so key areas like in Kenya, the central Kenya, the Rift Valley, and up to date, if you look at where the concentration of post-colonial lives, so the neo-colonialists are living, families of colonial families are living. It is, central Kenya, the Rift Valley, and you look at the, places like South Africa. So again, look at Zimbabwe. You find areas that really were seen to be able to produce, key agricultural spices, agricultural produce, and you find places which have minerals, so gold and others. So those at that particular time, gold was the main thing. Right now we have new sorts of rare earth, rare minerals, but at that time gold was very key. So you see that second part, and even within the agricultural economies, there was a whole aspect of creation of landlessness. So because the colonial masters took up the land and took it from people who were producing for themselves, it really then brought up, and I go back to the whole aspect where the colonial role in creating patriarchy in our communities. Yes, our African communities may have had their weaknesses around a patriarchal society, but then it deepened the colonial extraction, colonial framework really deepened patriarchy, because at that time, labor was not seen in terms of paid for labor. So at this particular time, the colonialists came into the continent and were creating a way that they were paying for labor. And their view of women was they could not do the hard labor that men were doing. So because of that, before there was no trade and there's no cash economy. But now, when there's a cash economy where you're paid a kobo, and so now the man has an income and the woman does not have. And so creating this whole conversation of unpaid labor started to happen, because then the men were the ones who had the money and who could buy the produce, because then now we're no longer barter trading. We are paying with cash, a cash economy that is brought in by a colonial model of trading and others. So you have all these mixes of things, which led to, first the colonialists have taken the land, and then they have fragmented the idea of commons, where communities traded and used land together. So you knew this was your land and territory, but it did not stop your neighbor from accessing it or from using it during certain seasons. But all of a sudden, the idea, our property regime started to change. And if you look at the global south and the African continent, particularly, the property regimes are framed on a colonial legal framework, which then said, if you look at all these discussions in the World Bank Declaration on land, it talks about, the need for property rights to address poverty. But no one really talked about the fact that how did the commons, how did the collective actually strengthen the ability of people to produce together collectively? So again, we were raised and our lives and social relations are based on a collective way of growth. You are because I am, the Ubuntu. But then now we came up with new property regimes was not in my backyard. And that not in my backyard, again, allowed for, as long as it's not in my place that you're extracting, it's not in my place that you're polluting, I can watch you as you go on polluting the next neighbor, not realizing that, water extraction, water abstraction, pollution of the land, cutting down the trees in the neighbor's backyard means that it also is affecting me. What is happening in the hurricanes in the southern part of Africa are affecting the rest of the continent. What is happening in the DRC Congo with volcanoes, active volcanoes, are affecting the rest of the continent. So when there is drought in another place, it is affecting the rest. Again, so that collective is what has been, again, a very colonial way of doing things. And so when you really look at it, that extractive model, our economic model of development is framed on an extractive model. And we never really speak about it, that unless we are able to go back. So even right now, after COVID and everyone's saying, build back better, what are we building back on? When we do not want to address our social economic relations, that we can talk about climate justice from here to Timbuktu. But what we are saying is, we will change the technology, which is currently patented in the colonial spaces. And then they come into, again, our global south and say, let's now do what? Let's do a green transition. We need to do a transition. But this transition is based on extracting minerals of bauxite, cobalt, aluminum, copper from the global south to build a technology that we are still struggling with, yet we are not the ones who messed the environment. So it's that mix of everything that's very extractive. They continue to take us. And you join it to something that Marisa said when she was talking about this panel, is even with that, the slave trade itself was extractive. So it did not only take the land and the people, and the relations, but the relations included taking the labor, taking the men, taking the people away from the continent to another part, which killed the relations, but also was the cheap labor that was needed to build the colonial, the colonies as they are. So it is very critical to look at all this, all those things are so related, from social, economic, environmental, cultural, and bring it all home to really ask ourselves, how do we frame our economic growth? How do we frame, and something that Pambana said was very critical was, even we talk about it, in terms of our land is related to identity, and it is interesting to see right now, getting back to Africa, you're seeing conversations where people are saying, we want to come back to our homeland, because we are raised knowing that, our place of birth, here we always talk about how where women bury the placenta. Mothers can tell you where their children come from, because that is where you bury your placenta when you give birth. But when you look at our food systems and you listen to the SDG conversations around food security, it doesn't want to recognize that food sovereignty is very critical, because the food security conversation, that this continent, the global conversations on food security are pegged on an extractive, a colonial, a system that doesn't recognize that food sovereignty is critical to the food systems and food security. So food security itself is talking about, the agras and the big, capitalist, companies coming in and giving you seed and giving you fertilizer. But food sovereignty is when you say, I can take my old seeds, I can find ways to culturally and indigenously grow the food the way I want, which is not the language that works for capital, and it doesn't work for a very neo-colonial, neoliberal way of conversation. So we've got to look at the climate justice conversation from the before, and looking at, it's not only the environmental extraction, it is the social, cultural, land and territorial extraction that continues to happen. And unless we start to address it and talk to it, then we start to really sugarcoat and massage, little issues here and there, but not really deal with the root causes. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much. You said so many things that, I had to write down because they resonated so much with me. When you said that colonialism was based on extraction, and not just the extraction of people, but identities, of culture, of labor, of just that idea of community, I think that has done so much to us that we don't necessarily think about or try to unpack. And again, as you rightly said, the fact that a lot of our economies, our economic structure is based on this extractivist idea of development, then at the end of the day, all we do is continue to degrade the environment and, reduce conservation in the name of development. But at the end of the day, development for who? Who benefits from these opportunities? Who are the ones who are at the forefront, of being able to say, I am benefiting from these economic processes that are being put in place. The marginalized continue to suffer. Those who are vulnerable continue to suffer. Those who rely heavily on the environment. When we look at fisher folk, when we look at farmers, you rightly mentioned women. These are persons who continue to be impacted, and it's because, again, the economic structures are so aligned to make sure that these persons continue to bear the brunt, of some of these processes. And when we think about climate justice, which is a recurrent theme across, the Global South Women's Forum, we recognize that it is something that everyone speaks about, and it's making sure that we move away from these extractivist economies to some that are more regenerative, create opportunities for transformation. Of course, development is critical, it's important, but as well, how do we make sure that we're able to maintain persons' lives and livelihoods while still, creating that connection with the environment? You spoke as well about communal resources, and Eleanor Ostrom speaks so much about common pool resources and collective action. And just listening to you kind of brought back some of those readings for me. And Ikal, I just think that you have, touched a lot in your particular statement just now. And I just like to continue to back the conversation to ask a little bit about just inclusion. So you would have mentioned some of the impacts and how these would have contributed to livelihood change and just the breakdown of families. But as it relates to just inclusion of those who are most marginalized and those who we continue to be vulnerable, do you think that their inclusion in international and kind of national dialogues and negotiations can in fact provide an opportunity for addressing the particular issue? So Ikal, I'd like to hear from you, just continuing from some of what you just mentioned, and then I'll hand over to Pambana to answer the same question. So Ikal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So that's a very interesting question when you think about it. The global dialogues, they are important, but we've got to recognize the power, the skewed power dynamics. How many conversations do we have in the global South? Why don't we have conversations in the global South? We have better air, we have better access, it's an amazing place to be. So why isn't it that, and I think about it, I remember a few years ago, when the then US President Barack Obama called all African presidents to fly to the US for a meeting. It was so absurd, just the fact that you had over 50 presidents packing their bags with entourages to fly out and see the president of the US. When you really look at it, it is a power dynamics, a very asymmetrical power that is assumed that we get a lot of foreign direct investments from the West, from northern state countries. But then when you really look at it, what leaves our continents is 3, 4, 5, 20 times much more than what comes in FDIs and aid. So I think unless we start to recognize, again, goes back to a very collective. If you look at, trade agreements that are had within the continent, within the global South, there is a keen need to fragment. So when you look at whether it's, no one wants to do a collective trade with the African continent, but they want to do with individual countries, negotiate differently, mostly to fragment the idea of collective. And I think until we start to, even within civil society, even within indigenous people, to be able to come together and agree on the what do we have, what is our power, what are we negotiating for, but also asking ourselves, who are we negotiating with? What is it we are negotiating? Because when you're negotiating, you're negotiating about your own lands and territories in another person's place. It's like somebody coming into your bedroom and telling you, well, we would like to do X, Y, Z in your bedroom. They've not asked you if they can get into your home. They've not asked you if, again, it goes back to a very colonial framing that nobody asked us that they should come into our continent and help us govern. So again, now we are going back to discuss how we should govern, how we should trade with our resources, how we should, in another person's land. So again, it really, until we ask ourselves, why are these meetings important? Who are we sitting with? What are we negotiating? What is the table like? It's like asking somebody to come to a dinner table in shorts, in tattered shorts and a torn t-shirt, and you're saying, we're all equal, we're inclusive, use all these big cliches. Yet you know very well, for them to get into the door, somebody will say, do you have a tuxedo? Do you have a black tie? It's a black tie party. But then there's somebody walking in with their traditional, regalia, but they're being asked, why do I have to wear a black tie? Why can't I come with my traditional clothes? All these things have got to be asked, because it is only through the understanding of the asymmetry of power, of understanding the space that we are having this conversation and what we are negotiating and the contestations around it, that we can really say whether it is of need for us or not. And without that, it just becomes another space and another opportunity for a political elite to go and shop in some of the biggest fashion stores.
Hearing you say that just now made me think a lot about some of the conversations that we would have been having about tokenism and the persons just wanting to tick a box. So yes, we included you at the table and we gave you an opportunity to share your experiences, but that doesn't necessarily mean we will consider them or create any space for them to be included in our ongoing processes. So you just hit the nail on the head with this idea of tokenistic engagement and just having persons there so that at the end of the day, you can say, but we included them, but to what extent? So thank you for sharing that. I'm really happy that you were able to bring that out. Pambana, your views on the inclusion, particularly when we look at these sort of dialogues?
My co-panelist just gave such a tremendous contribution on that question. I think I was sitting here wondering what participation in these national and international dialogues. I'm interested in the alternative ones, you know, and not out of my own interest, but because that's what people's movements have been furthering in the Caribbean, in Abya Yala and the Americas, despite, you know, the incredible power of the OAS, of the US and Canada as financial, political, media powerhouses. So, you know, ALBA, Petrocaribe, UNASUR, CELAC, Telesur. I would be interested in you know, what movements assessments are of those bodies at this time as a space in which there could be genuine, you know, regional integration, where CARICOM can be a space for Caribbean nations to come to some joint discussion, because there have been some brave national plans that have been put forth. And certainly I think, and I don't know if it's unique to this region, but the scale of catastrophes that our people are facing requires big bodies and cooperation between peoples or nations or organizations or movements, some kind of joint strategy, because, you know, COVID has provided this example of how well, let me look to New Orleans. So before I moved to Havana, I was living in New Orleans, also part of the Caribbean basin, similar histories, plantation economies, recently, when Hurricane Ida passed through Louisiana and created complete havoc and devastation, it was so tremendous to witness the solidarity of people, just people's impulse to help each other, to take care of one another, to practice mutual aid, solidarity, to send monies, to work on covering tarps, you know, roofs with tarps, to share resources on evacuation. All of that is so beautiful. And the scale of what we're up against, it's like we also need governments that are not trying to kill us. You know, we need governments or bigger entities that are protecting collective rights, that are not protecting corporate interests and extraction and these colonial legacies and development models that are so racist and misogynist and anti-worker and harmful. You know, do those exist currently? Are those things that, for example, you all are building in these tricontinental dialogues and coming to a joint agenda that is environmentally just as well as feminist? I do again, you know, think that having witnessed Cuba's COVID response, and I have become kind of a Cubaphile, it is by no means perfect, but this small Caribbean island that has such limited resources has been able to save more lives, ensure that fewer people get sick, because of public action, as well as trust and confidence in their public health system, of which they are protagonists, You know, you walk outside and there's a polyclinic close by, there's a clinic, there's a hospital, there's a dentist. They may not have all of the medicines, in part because of the 60-year blockade by the US, and also because colonialism caused impoverishment. But there are resources that are centered on humans taking care of each other. And, you know, through this, as well as the government carrying out really clear messaging. I mean, from January of last year, saying, although the WHO has not called for these measures in hospitals, we are putting them in place. We responded to Ebola, and these are some of the mechanisms and measures we put in place. We're putting them in place again. We will invest in subsidized food. We will raise salaries of government workers who are the majority of workers. We will, you know, give people at-home recipes for, you know, the bleach, the cloro, you know, concoctions that people put in front of their homes. We will dispatch information and resources in the tens of thousands of masks through mass organizations that include the Federation of Cuban Women, through the neighborhood councils, the committees in defense of revolution. Basically, I have a different understanding of the capacity of and importance of governments when they are responding not to the requirements of profiteering, but to the requirements of saving lives, even with their, you know, contradictions, ongoing struggles, persisting inequities, just that kind of basic configuration. So I'm not sure that there exists on the international, you know, field space in which there is not that inequity that is, you know, both absurd and really painfully real for global South peoples, movements, nations to make decisions that are best for, you know, for the region. But I do think it's necessary to think seriously about national as well as international cooperation and joint agendas. I'm not sure that answers the question. But whereas in the past, I would disregard, you know, all of these bodies, I'm a little bit more interested in how the Global South organized efforts can take them over.
You did, in fact, respond, and you responded well. So thank you so much. And that last point that you closed on, just how, you know, better integration and, you know, probably better organization among global South countries may, in fact, provide an opportunity for us to have greater bargaining power when we do, in fact, go into these spaces. So thank you for that, Pambana. So the last question that I have and that I will pose to both panelists speaks to moving forward and, you know, looking to the future. And so what, if any, do you consider to be other potential solutions or alternative solutions, as Pambana has spoken about, for disrupting, you know, these kind of colonial processes that we see apparent today and that are so entrenched into our laws and policies, which continue to exacerbate a lot of these climate change impacts? So for you, how do we disrupt what exists to create opportunities, you know, for increased resilience, particularly among the vulnerable and the marginalized? Ikal, I'll have you go first, and then Pambana, you can follow up.
Thank you, and thanks, Pambana, for just, you know, bringing that soul into the conversation. One of the ways I was laughing because when you say disruptor, I was like, yeah, we need to disrupt the system. Disrupting the systems and rethinking we can use all sorts of words, indigenizing the systems, localizing the systems. We've got to really think about what works for us to disrupt these systems that we are, so that when we are asked to build back better, we can then say, how are we building back? What are we building back? When we are asked to, you know, to transition, energy transition, we have to ask ourselves, what are we transitioning from? What are we transitioning to? Are we still basing it in a very centralized system that doesn't talk about, women cooperatives, market women, solar cooperatives, that doesn't allow local communities to develop, wind energy or solar energy or biomass energy, biogas, that they can then supply to the grid. Like, what exactly does it mean to build back better? What does it mean to transition? Where are we transitioning from? Or does it just mean, and there's an African saying that if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. And and that sort of saying has forced us to join a table that doesn't fit our values. So we've got to start saying, what is our value system? Who are we walking this path with? Where are we getting our funding from to do the kind of work that we are doing? And how do we start to really disrupt those power systems? And even in that, how do we create, give the power back to the communities? And in that, really put women at the center of it. Because when you talk about women, you're not just talking about production, but you're talking about reproduction. You're talking about realizing the disproportionate impact of a colonial, extractive, climate unjust system on women. So really making sure that women are at the center of it is going to be a very critical thing. And really in thinking about it, recognizing, and I love, one thing I love about the Cuban examples is that really centering on a very public system, public good. We have, and I was, a friend of mine, Crystal, was talking about the fact that COVID has really created a very confused space for the middle class, because for the first time the middle class did not have to, like in Kenya, vaccines are free. So the middle class have not been able to pay their way into something. They've not been able to create some tenders and tenderpreneurship around access to this vaccine. And so until we can go back to moving away from addressing public problems with privatization, because many times, we see the public education system doesn't work, we take our children to private schools. We've got to start dealing with these issues. So really, strengthening the public and common goods, disrupting the systems that we have been told works for us. And I love the way you said, Janelle, that development is important. It is very important. And we've got to keep saying, whose development? Why is this development? Where is it coming from? Who does it include? What Pambana said, what do we talk when we talk about participation? What exactly is participating? And everyone thinks that free, prior, informed consent is a UN principle. It is not. Our cultural ways of doing things. If you look at the way, these days you can go date and come back, but if you look at the ways that women, men came into our homes to ask for a girl's hand in marriage, it was a very, they came first and said, I am so and so, and they were asked, where do you come from? What do you do? What are you bringing? Go back and come back another day. If you came to ask for a place to, to till the land, you came and asked and you were told, wait first, we will get back to you. So there was a process of coming to give, ask for free, for something, and you were told, you'd be giving the information free of what you wanted. It was given in advance. The consent was a process discussed, and you went and asked, and the person went back and came back. So really strengthening those systems that allowed development in our lands for us to be a consultative process. And once we start to really develop that, but really centering it around women, that recognizing that we as women suffer the brunt of extraction, where people say you will get jobs. It is unpaid labor that goes to the men, that leaves the women tendering to the homestead, because when the homestead crashes, then the man comes and says, you left the homestead to crash. And then, so everything is really that we continue to carry the burden. And I love when, we say women are resilient, but it doesn't mean that we have to suffer to continue being claimed to be resilient. So we've got to really be able to start to ask the questions, when you talk about resilience, what is this resilience we're talking about? Is it a term that we keep using to burden the woman and to burden the women from the global south more, so to continue extracting their resources, to extract their culture, to extract everything that, to extract their souls, just to be able to say we created a development. So thank you very much for just that conversation and continued comments.
That was a really good point to transition to Pambana. Pambana, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
That was an excellent, again, contribution by Ikal. I agree wholeheartedly. I think being very clear, like building power from below, ideological clarity, building strong organizations, building transnational, building unity across imposed borders, across continents is so important. When I think about the example of people's impulse to help and to show solidarity with each other, how can we turn those moments into organization? How do we keep in touch with people? How do we consolidate our participation and other people's participation in the movement? How do we organize with just incredible dedication and realization that we're living in just such barbaric times? I think it's something like 4.5 million people now have died from COVID. So many of those deaths were preventable if it weren't for billionaires trying to become more billionaire, and how do we channel both the anger and despair, the burden on women in particular, on marginalized peoples, from COVID, doing all of the care economy work. In Cuba, women's organizations and many women are leading campaigns and formal recognition of what it means that women have taken on care of the elderly, children who aren't currently in school. These are debts that need to be repaid. And so too for structural adjustment. There needs the IMF, the World Bank, these international financial institutions need to be held to task for having coerced so many of our territories and nations to decrease subsidies, to privatize, to chip away or outright abolish the public good that Ikal speaks to defending and even deepening, and that we needed so much in these times. So neoliberalism, certainly not the answer. And there are many alternatives that people are building and that must be built that should center collective decision-making. There's so many examples of this across the Americas. Colombia, in their months of protests, the people carried out deep collective decision-making processes or asambleas at the points of resistance. The Garifuna Nation across much of Central America carries out assemblies, figuring out ways to make decisions that benefit and center the majorities. And it is often women who are leading in that. And those are answers that protect most people and the planet. Definitely when it comes to other policies, the US needs to be held to task for, putting an end to militarism, arms sale warfare. Just days ago, they've okayed $750 billion for the US military. There are 800 plus bases across the world, at least that we know of, in over 70 countries. AFRICOM is expanding. We need a world without war. We need a world without nuclear weapons. We need a world in which resources go towards people's health, people's education, people's arts and culture, sports, exchange, scientific, cultural endeavors. And right, that's what we need. How do we do it? I think it's important to look to those places where people are fighting against neoliberalism and building alternatives, despite and amidst the aftermath of colonialism, of neocolonialism, of privatization and disinvestment in poor communities.
Oh, perfect. And that's such an amazing way to end our session. We've heard so many things. We've heard about alternatives to neoliberalism. We've spoken about development, particularly bottom-up development, just how development is currently framed, but for who benefits who are the main, individuals who are able to benefit from these sorts of processes that are currently in place. Inclusion, we've spoken about that, but how genuine are these sort of tables that are being set forth? And I like the idea of the fact that if you're not at the table, oftentimes you're on the menu. That's something that I know I will keep in my thoughts. And I think one of the things that are one of the key takeaways for me from this conversation is that, a lot has happened and marginalized and vulnerable continue to be exploited. And it's time for us to right our wrongs and to just recognize that we need to correct some of these infractions that have been meted out. But the way that we go about it has to, have people and planet at the center. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to say thank you all so much for joining, to both our panelists who were able to, share their perspectives, to share all that they have seen in these different spaces. Thank you both so much. It was a very enriching conversation for me. I learned a lot, and, I was able to cement a lot of the thoughts I had as well. To the audience and to everyone who attended, thank you so much. I saw so many amazing comments in the chat. Unfortunately, we weren't able to, look at them specifically, but I do know that we will be able to, in other forums, be able to pick up on this in the future. So everyone, just thank you so much. We have another session that is supposed to be starting soon. So I hope that some of you will be in attendance at that, which promises to be another very engaging and valuable space. So thank you all again so much. Please do continue to be safe, and we will see you in the next session. Bye, everyone.